This lecture is on Latin America. Like Africa, which we covered in the last lecture, this is obviously a large region with many countries, and within one lecture we're not going to have the time to cover in detail individual countries in Latin America. Like Africa though, I think you can make the argument that there's been enough coherence in the economic experience of countries in Latin America that it's possible to give an overview of the economic development of the region. Keeping in mind, of course, that there's going to be heterogeneity in the experience of individual countries that causes them to depart from that overall experience. In this section of the lecture, I'm going to give an overview primarily of economic development in Latin America. Before I get to the economic development, first of all, just a map to show you the area of Latin America. This is a map that's got a whole lot of extra political information on it from a couple of years ago, but actually on Wikimedia Commons it was the only map that showed the whole of Latin America with the individual countries identified that I could find. As I said, there's a lot of differences in experience of the countries within Latin America, but one way that the region is sometimes broken up is to think of there being a tropical group of countries where the growing of tropical crops, agricultural crops, historically has been important in economic development. There's what are called the Southern Cone countries, where there's temperate climate and grasslands, particularly say in Argentina, Uruguay, that have meant that growing crops and pastoral activities have been important economic activity historically. And then we've got a group of countries in the northwest, Mexico, Peru, Bolivia, where often mining activity has been an important source of economic activity. So that's a simplification, but it's also sometimes a classification that's been adopted to, in very broad terms, describe the structure of economic activity in Latin America. One other background point before we get to talk about economic development, which will set the context for the time period that we're going to be looking at, is the dates at which colonisation of Latin America commenced, and then the dates at which a large number of countries in Latin America became independent. This is a graph that I showed in the last lecture on Africa. It was a graph that included all countries in the world, both African and Latin American and other places in the world. The point I want to make here is that the group of countries which are down here in the bottom left-hand corner are the countries that are the larger Latin American countries. So if we're talking about countries like, say, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, then basically the historical experience of those countries was to be colonised in the 15th and 16th centuries and then to obtain independence in the period from 1800 to 1850, or around about the 1810s and 1820s. So in thinking about Latin American economic development, we're primarily going to focus on periods after independence from 1820 onwards, but where it's relevant, thinking back to the historical circumstances of colonisation to also think about longer lasting effects of colonisation on growth after independence. This table begins the set of material in this section of the lecture trying to give an overview of the economic development experience in Latin America. It shows the GDP growth rate from 1820, the period around about independence for a lot of the major countries in Latin America, through to 2010, and divided up into a series of phases in that period. If we go through those phases one by one, we can see 1820 to 1870, which is the period, the 50 years immediately after a lot of countries gained independence. You can see that Latin America's growth experience was relatively slow compared to Western Europe and the Western offshoot. So Latin America at that time certainly wasn't participating in the benefits of the Industrial Revolution as was occurring in Western Europe and the Western offshoots. From 1870 to 1913, though, we see that the growth rate in GDP per capita is 1.7% per annum, and that's quite comparable to what was being achieved in the fastest growing regions of the world, the Western offshoots, what was still being achieved in Western Europe. So 1870 to 1913, and in fact a little bit after that, was a period of relative economic success for Latin America. And we'll see that that was a period when Latin America did manage to tie into the countries in the West that were developing rapidly as a result of the Industrial Revolution and benefit from that in terms of its own economic growth. The period from 1913 to 1950, so growth rate of 1.4% in GDP per capita, you can see that that's stronger than in some parts of the world, Asia and Africa, but slower than in other parts of the world. For example, the Western offshoots and the countries that make up the former USSR, and it represented a slowing of economic growth compared to the previous period. From 1950 to 1980, there's again relatively strong economic growth in Latin America, certainly stronger than in Africa, about the same as in the Western offshoots, but not as strong as is happening in Asia and not as strong as is happening through catch-up and convergence in Western Europe at the time. And then from 1980 to 2010, we see a big falling away in the rate of growth in GDP per capita in Latin America, where it's significantly below the rates achieved in Asia and Africa, and also the rates that are being achieved in the Western world. So we can see that the overall record here is one of what we might refer to as steady but not spectacular economic growth, and in particular we note the falling away of growth in GDP per capita for the region as a whole in the last 30 years. Let's look in a little bit more detail at the experience of individual countries in Latin America. First of all, starting out with two groups of countries. The group that Madison defines as the larger 8 Latin American economies, and we'll see what those economies are in the next slide where we look at their individual experiences, and the other Latin American economies. And you can see that the overall growth experience of Latin America, which is the green line, that's the evolution of GDP per capita from around about 1950 onwards, that really parallels quite closely the Latin American 8. So if you're thinking about data on the growth experience of Latin America as a whole, you're thinking about a growth experience that's largely driven by this group of countries that Madison describes as the Latin American 8, the larger countries. So let's have a look at the growth experience of those 8 countries, which is Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, Uruguay, and Venezuela. And you can see here some consistency of experience, but also a degree of heterogeneity. If we look back at the start in the late 19th century, we see that there's a whole group of countries which would be classified as relatively low income at the time and which are pretty similar to each other. There's a group of countries which would be classified as relatively higher income at the time, Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay. If we look at sort of those groups of countries, we see they've all experienced this pattern of slow but steady growth in GDP per capita over time. That's the predominant pattern. But we can also see that there's some significant departures from that pattern. For example, we notice that Chile, when we get to the 1990s, has a spectacular takeoff in GDP per capita that takes it from about $6,000 in GDP per capita up to $14,000 GDP per capita in a period of just about 20 years. We see the experience of Venezuela, which starts out in the poorer group of countries, then has spectacular growth from having GDP per capita only about $1,000 back in the 1920s up to having over $10,000 in the late 1970s, early 1980s. But then we see the collapse away of GDP per capita in Venezuela after that. We also see for individual countries like, for example, Argentina, lots of ups and downs occurring over time. So when we look at the experience of these 8 larger economies, we see some consistency in experience of relatively slow but steady growth over time. We also see some large departures from that. For example, Chile's recent growth, or the pattern of growth in Venezuela, or the ups and downs experienced at various times by Argentina. How is the growth experience of countries in Latin America compared to other parts of the world in terms of the level of GDP per capita? This graph benchmarks 4 of the Latin American economies against the United States. So this is another graph where I've just normalised GDP per capita in the United States to be equal to 100 in every year from 1870 to 2010. So you can think of the line for each of the Latin American countries then as telling you the percentage of US GDP per capita that existed in that country in a particular year. So if we look at Argentina, for example, we can see that from the 1870s to the late 19th, early 20th century, Argentina experiences very rapid growth. So rapid that, notwithstanding the fact that the United States was becoming the industrial leader at the time and therefore experiencing very rapid growth itself in historical terms, that Argentina catches up from 60% to 100% against the United States, but then early in the 20th century starts to fall away and really in many ways has had a pretty consistent falling away since that time through to the present, where Argentine GDP per capita is only about 25% of that of the United States. Chile, we can see, starts out similar to Argentina, about 60%, stable up until the early 20th century, then really a gradual decline until this period of 1990, where Chilean GDP per capita grows from about 25 to 35% of the United States. And again, we can see the other 2 countries there, Mexico and Brazil, relatively steady against the United States at about 20% of GDP. So by and large, we're talking about economies that have a relatively large distance to catch up to the world's leading economies. However, that's a comparison with the developed world. If we compare with the developing world, and this goes back to the initial slide on economic development that I presented, which showed that in many sub-periods, Latin America, while not having growth rates as rapid as, for example, Western Europe or Western offshoots, has had growth rates that are stronger than other regions that we identified, such as Asia or Africa. And this slide really builds on that by presenting information from the Human Development Index, the most recent data for 2011. This is the same chart that I presented for Africa, but this time I've bolded in the information on Latin America and the Caribbean, which is the relevant region that the United Nations identify in that report. So we can see that the development experience of Latin America, Caribbean is behind that of the very high development countries in the world. So lower HDI index, lower life expectancy, lower years of schooling, gross national income per capita that's about a third of the very high development countries. But if we compare to other regions which would be considered developing, you can see that Latin American, Caribbean is actually doing relatively well compared to those regions. So stronger outcomes than in sub-Saharan Africa, stronger outcomes than in South Asia, than in the Arab states, and also on average in East Asia and the Pacific, although you can see that East Asia and the Pacific are catching up to Latin America and the Caribbean. So at least in terms of average economic development outcomes, Latin America, on the basis of its growth experience, its independent, slots in some distance below the very high development countries in the world, but slots in above quite a few of the developing countries and developing regions of the world. That's average. And when we talk about Latin America, one point that it's very important to recognise is the degree of inequality. And so in this graph, I've got a graph that shows on the horizontal axis GDP per capita in 2010, and on the vertical axis the Gini coefficient, the same measure of inequality as I've used to describe income inequality previously. The Gini coefficient is a measure that runs from 0 to 1. 0 would be perfect equality, 1 would be perfect inequality, where there was in effect one person in the population earning all of the income. And what I've done is I've got data on the Gini coefficient and GDP per capita for the 8 major Madison Latin American countries, and then I've got data on GDP per capita and the Gini coefficient for all of the top 10 countries in the United Nations Human Development Index, for which I could get data on both those variables. And you see that there's a clear clustering of observations that, not surprisingly, the HDI top 10 have higher levels of GDP per capita than the Latin American economies. But the other thing you notice is that on average there's a much lower level of inequality in those top 10 HDI countries than there is in Latin America. And so when we think about economic development and economic well-being in Latin America, it's one thing to look at the average outcomes, but then we also really need, because of the extent of inequality, to think about the distribution of outcomes as well. And one way that becomes clear is if we look at poverty rates in Latin America. So this is data on the percentage of households below the World Bank poverty line in 2000, and you can see that in a lot of these regions there's relatively high poverty rates. So even if we're focusing on the larger regions, Argentina 10%, Brazil 30%, Chile 15%, Colombia 40 to 50%. So notwithstanding reasonable average outcomes, because of the level of inequality, high levels of poverty across most of the major and other countries in Latin America. The final overview perspective that I wanted to give with presenting data was just about population. And so this is a graph that shows the share of world population in different regions of the world from 1820 to 2009, with the regions identified in the legend there. And the one that we're focusing on here, of course, is Latin America. And so what I want to point out is just the steady growth in the share of world population in Latin America. And so, of course, what that means is that the rate of population growth in Latin America, particularly in the period 1950 to 2009, but also 1913 to 1950, has been above that of a lot of other regions in the world. So, for example, in Western Europe, where the share of population is declining, in Eastern Europe, where it's declining, in East Asia, where there was this long-run decline as well. And so relatively high rates of population growth is also another factor to take account of in thinking about the capacity for countries in Latin America to have increased their GDP per capita, or as a brake that's operated on increasing GDP per capita in the past century. So what should we conclude from this overview on the development experience of Latin America? Well, I think you can think of there being long-run perspective to take and short-run perspective to take. The long-run perspective to take is that I think when you look at the period after 1820, you have to conclude that there's been a failure across the region as a whole to show any significant convergence towards high-income countries such as the United States. So despite the fact that there's been slow, steady economic growth across a lot of the period since 1820, that's really only, on average, kept Latin America at the same level against Western Europe, against the United States, for example. And in fact, some of the economies, as we saw, like Argentina, have fallen back from the levels that they attained, or that they had in the middle of the 19th century, and that they attained thereafter. Latin America, when we compare across regions and within sub-periods, it's rarely been the slowest growing region, but it's never really been the fastest growing region, and it's never experienced sustained economic growth in a way that's allowed it to converge towards the rich countries in the world, with, as I note here, some false starts where it's appeared that it might be about to be taking off in its economic growth experience. If we look within the short-run phases, I think if we look at the period 1820 to 1870, there we see that growth was relatively slow. So we're saying there, look, in the immediate aftermath of independence, relatively slow economic growth. Then we saw from 1870 to 1913, relatively strong economic growth. 1913 to 1950 and 1950 to 1980, in the middle of the pack, not growing as strong as the strongest growing economies, Western Europe, Western offshoots, but growing more strongly than, for example, Africa. But then 1980 to 2010, really falling further behind lots of parts of Asia and falling behind really even Africa during that period as well. So in terms of developing world, it would have to be judged as relatively slow growth during that period. As I've noted, I think to a large degree you can think of the patterns that I've just identified as being a reasonable description of the overall Latin American economic experience. But as we've seen in this data overview, there's definitely heterogeneity between countries, some of which we'll take up in succeeding sections of this lecture. In the other section of this lecture, I'm going to cover three main phases of Latin American economic development, the history of Latin American economic development. The first section is going to cover the period from 1820 through to around about the 1920s, about the Great Depression. I'm going to talk firstly about the aftermath of colonisation and then talk about how it is that the Latin American economies came to grow at a comparable rate to the fastest growing parts of the world in the period from 1870 on to the 1920s. In the second section of the lecture, I'm going to talk about the period which runs from around about the Great Depression through to the 1970s, a period when Latin America fairly consistently adopted a policy approach called import substituting industrialisation, and talk about what that policy was and what its consequences for economic development were. The third and final section will talk about the period from the 1980s onwards, which is a period where there have been significant financial crises and an attempted, but by and large halting, reform of Latin American economies. In the next section of the lecture, we'll be looking at the first one of these topics on the aftermath of colonisation and a path to growth.